Nice to see you again for the second session of this study on Acts from my recent book, Acts, A Global Perspective. You can get it from Amazon either under that title or my name, W. Robert Shade III. Last time we talked about how Jesus had great success in his earthly ministry, but at the end of it, there weren't very many people following him, and they all forsook him and fled. Jesus sent the Spirit on the day of Pentecost, and the Spirit indwelt each believer, and now each believer is a quote unquote little Christ, and he sent his people out into the world, and they had great success in the Roman Empire. And then 2,000 years later, this amazing movement is still going on through his people. We want to talk today about some of the purposes of the book of Acts, and indeed the two-volume set of the Gospel of Luke and its sequel, the book of Acts. I believe, with some other famous commentators, like Longenecker and I.H. Marshall, that the primary purpose of Acts, as is the Gospel of Luke, is apologetic / evangelistic. Apologetic, not that he was sorry for anything, but it is the defense of the faith. Why should we believe this gospel? That is prominent in both the Gospel and the book of Acts. And of course, a defense of the faith immediately leads to evangelistic persuasion. Why should we believe this new religion? Well, the book of Acts is an answer to that. It gives certainty. It says in the book of Luke, chapter 1, verse 4, the author wants Theophilus, the one to whom the books are dedicated, to know the certainty of the things that you have been taught. So Theophilus is a Christian, and for any Christian, that they know the certainty of the things that have been taught. A number of phrases are piled up in Luke 1:4 to reinforce this idea. Eyewitnesses from the beginning, handed down to us, carefully investigated, and orderly account. Now, this is true of both the book of Luke and the book of Acts. Now, I would like you to take a look at this chart which I have made comparing the book of Luke with the book of Acts. In the Gospel of Luke, we have Jesus in person. Of course, he's ministering on the earth. In the book of Acts, Jesus is still active, but it's through his church. He incarnated himself in many believers. In the Gospel of Luke, the territory of ministry is Palestine only. In the book of Acts, it's to the ends of the earth. In the book of Luke, the people who are evangelized are only Jews. However, now Gentiles are not only included, but there is a major mission to the Gentiles. In the Gospel of Luke, we are still in the era of the law of Moses, the dispensation of the law. Jesus, his entire life, kept the law of Moses, not the traditions of the Pharisees, which were added, but the law of Moses. And that was required of true believers in the gospel. But now in Acts, we have a transition to the rule of the Spirit and the law of Christ. One of the important purposes of the book of Acts is to trace a momentous transition in salvation history. Today, most of us who are Gentile believers in Christ take these changes for granted, but it was not obvious to the early Jewish Christians that the Gentiles were even included in the salvation plan of God, or that the law of Moses would not be entirely uh, in force even in the new dispensation. And God had to do a special work in the life of Peter to get him to go to the house of Cornelius, the first Gentile household that was converted, Acts 10. The church in Antioch was not born, largely Gentile church, by apostolic strategy, but almost by accident, so to speak, really in the providence of God, of course. The question of whether the new believers in Christ, Gentile believers, had to obey the law of Moses was a point of sharp contention. Paul said, no, you don't have to. And in the book of Galatians, he calls that requirement another gospel. But it took the Jerusalem Council in chapter 15 of Acts to really settle the question. Now, there was another point that many scholars feel is a purpose of the book of Acts, and one is to establish the new religion, this gospel of Jesus the Messiah, as a religio licita. That's Latin, and it means a legitimate religion, a religion officially recognized. Now, Judaism was already recognized by the Roman authorities. The Jews had synagogues all over the eastern part of the Roman Empire, and indeed as many as 13 in Rome itself. So Judaism was okay. And this new variation of Judaism, those who believed that Jesus of Nazareth was the Jewish Messiah, not called Christianity yet or Christians yet, but they kind of were covered under that Jewish religion, which was already recognized. But the split was coming. And we see certain accusations against the Christians in the ministry of Paul, accused of unlawful customs, Acts 16, treason against Caesar, worship contrary to the law. But in every case, the case is either dismissed or the Christians come out okay. And one Roman official, proconsul Sergius Paulus in Crete, was recognized as, well, he probably became a believer. So the Roman officials were either said it's okay or dismissed the case, or maybe they were very impressed. We find this particularly in the trials of Paul before Roman officials, Festus and Felix, in the end of Acts. Now, another purpose for the book of Acts would fall under the category of apologetic, and that is the vindication of and promotion of Paul. Now, Paul was a suspicious character to the very earliest Christians, and he had a hard time getting accepted. We see that in the end of, after his conversion in chapter 9, he was not one of the original apostles. He did not require Gentiles to keep the law of Moses. In fact, he fought against it. He spent most of his time preaching to unclean Gentiles. He always went to the Jewish synagogue first, but and then for many, there was not enough law and too much grace in Paul's gospel. And this is the reason, I think, that his conversion is recorded in full 3 times. We have it in chapter 9, chapter 22, chapter 26, with minor variations. And in 22, Paul himself is telling the story. But anyway, uh, why is it repeated 3 times? It's to establish the fact that Christ appeared in person to the Apostle Paul, and now he is legitimate. He is a real apostle. Paul is clearly Luke's hero in the book of Acts. We have a table here that shows how Luke deliberately presented Paul as just as important as Peter. Everything Peter did, Paul did also. He healed a lame man, both of them, Peter in chapter 3, Paul in chapter 14. There was what I call healing at a distance. Well, Peter's shadow fell on people. Not sure they were healed or not. But anyway, a similar strange thing happened with handkerchiefs and aprons being taken from Paul in chapter 19, and people were healed. Both cast out demons. Peter in chapter 5, Paul in chapter 16. Both confounded a sorcerer. Peter in chapter 8, Paul in chapter 13. Both raised a person from the dead. Peter, Dorcas in chapter 9, Paul, Eutychus in chapter 20. Both had a miraculous escape from jail. Peter, chapter 12, Paul, chapter 16. These are too many to be accidental or coincidental. Luke has a deliberate plan at work here. I think there's one more reason I want to deal with purpose for the book of Acts today, and that is what I think was an unspoken question in the minds of many Gentiles. Now, we don't have this recorded. This is my speculation, but I think the average Gentile would have this unspoken question: why did the Jews reject Jesus, who claimed to be the Messiah? They were the experts on Messiah in the prophecies, and they were the ones who knew him and saw him and that 3-year period of his life when he was doing ministry. So what's going on here? I think both in the Gospels and in the book of Acts, there is an answer to the question of why the Jews rejected Jesus. I think that they rejected him despite overwhelming evidence, his miracles, and the miracles continue in the book of Acts, in the early chapters especially. They rejected him because their position was threatened, especially the leadership, the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the chief priests. They also rejected him, perhaps because they were expecting a triumphant, victorious conqueror Messiah, not a wretched, condemned criminal suffering on a cross. If he died on the cross, by the way, the Muslims still believe this today. Well, they believe he could not. He was a prophet of God. Therefore, he could not die on the cross. That simply could not happen. So they deny it and say another person took his place. But Jews at the time may have had the very same doubt and question. How can this be the Messiah? The final answer, I believe, of why they rejected him. They rejected him despite overwhelming evidence and in the face of things like the resurrection of Lazarus, for example, and the other resurrections, healing the blind, healing the deaf, Despite all that, they rejected him anyway. In the final analysis, I think their rejection of their Messiah is twofold. Number one, many, even a fierce fanatic persecutor like the Saul, did believe, and thousands of them did believe. We get the numbers 3,000 in an early chapter, 5,000 believed later. These were all Jewish people. So, one answer to the problem is many did believe. And number two, those who did not believe did not present a reasonable case or argue against it. Usually there was a riot. People called together to hound the apostles out of town, that kind of thing. So let's end this session for today. And next time, we'll talk about the importance of Acts, the historical reliability of Acts, the titles of government officials in Acts, the date of Acts, the author of Acts, the structure of Acts. I don't know if we can do all that in one session, but we need to get on with it. See you next time.